It was a foggy Thursday morning in early March, the kind where the dew clings to your skin and time seems to move slower than usual. The small town of Westbridge was still rubbing its eyes awake, and most of its 6,000 residents were only beginning to stir. But inside a modest brick home on the edge of Elmwood Street, Richard Harper was already up, dressed in a navy windbreaker, sitting quietly on the front porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Richard had just turned 63 3 weeks prior. Retirement had arrived without much fanfare. No gold watch, no final speech. After nearly 38 years working as a high school history teacher, the school board had sent a thank you card, signed in black marker by students who probably wouldn't remember who he was in a few years. He had once imagined this phase of life would feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like silence. There were no bells to signal periods. No students asking if Lincoln and Kennedy were secretly related. No lesson plans to fuss over late into the night. Just long stretches of time that echoed. His wife, Ellen, had passed 6 years earlier, a victim of ovarian cancer that came quick and without mercy. Their daughter, Vanessa, lived 2 states away with 2 toddlers of her own. She called often, but it wasn't the same as presence. Most days, Richard found himself walking the same route through the neighborhood park, waving to the same joggers, sitting on the same bench beneath a half-bloomed dogwood tree, watching life go by like it had forgotten him on purpose. That particular Thursday, something shifted. As he took the final sip of his coffee, he glanced at the leather-bound journal Ellen had gifted him a decade ago. It still sat on the side table, half empty, pages mostly untouched. Inside the cover she had written, "For your second chapter. I know it'll be better than the first." He had always smiled at the inscription but never believed it. A second chapter? At his age? But something about that morning asked a different question. Not what now, but why not? By noon, Richard found himself driving into town. He hadn't been downtown in months. The main street, once familiar, had changed, new shops, a yoga studio, even a small startup office above the old bakery. The library, however, remained the same. Tall windows, oak doors, and the smell of old paper that always reminded him of simpler days. Inside, he wandered the aisles, not really searching for anything. Then he saw it. A flyer pinned to a corkboard near the checkout desk. Community Writing Workshop, for anyone who has a story to tell. The words felt like an invitation whispered only to him. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his coat pocket. That evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Richard sat at his kitchen table with the flyer in front of him. He opened Ellen's journal and stared at the blank page. Then he wrote, "I'm not done yet." That sentence became a seed. In the days that followed, Richard began writing daily. Not full pages at first, just fragments, memories of childhood, moments with Ellen, old student stories, fragments of dreams he used to have about traveling, learning languages, building something that mattered. The act itself reignited something long buried. He began to feel purpose in the quiet. The workshop met every Tuesday evening in the library's back room. The first time he walked in, he nearly turned back. The room was filled with people younger than his daughter. They had laptops and tattoos and confidence he hadn't felt in decades. But then a young woman, no older than 25, smiled at him and said, "Glad you came." That small sentence, ordinary as it was, landed deep. He introduced himself simply. "Richard, I'm retired. I'm just trying to see if there's more." And there was. Each week he shared more of his stories. He discovered he had a voice that people listened to, not because it was loud, but because it was lived. He talked about growing up before smartphones, about teaching kids who didn't want to be taught, about falling in love at 24 and holding her hand through the final chemo treatment. Others listened, took notes, asked for more. They told him his words made them feel less alone. Soon he wasn't just writing. He was mentoring. One evening, a boy named Malik, barely 18, stayed behind and said, "I didn't think someone like you would get someone like me, but you do. Thank you." Richard felt his throat tighten. He smiled and said, "You'd be surprised how much we all have in common. I've been the quiet kid too." By summer, Richard had compiled nearly 200 pages of personal essays. He titled the manuscript, the second chapter. A small press in a neighboring city picked it up, and though the print run was modest, it sold out within weeks. Readers wrote in, saying his stories reminded them that it's never too late, that even at 60 or 70 or beyond, a new season can begin. He started speaking at senior centers, coffee shops, and even schools again, not as a teacher, but as someone who had discovered life doesn't end at retirement or loss. He told audiences, "You don't retire from purpose. You retire from jobs. Purpose doesn't care about your age." One afternoon, as he stepped off the small stage at a community center in Lincolnville, a woman about his age approached him. Her name was Joan. She had been widowed last year and was struggling to find a reason to keep going. "You said something up there," she told him. "You said, 'You're not done yet.' I'd forgotten that could even be true." Richard offered a warm smile, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how that feels. "You're not," he said gently. "None of us are. As long as we're still here, something still needs us." They talked for hours afterward about books, about loss, about starting again. She mentioned she had always wanted to paint but never had the courage. Richard told her, "Start with color. The courage comes later." In the months that followed, they became good friends. Richard found himself laughing more, waking up with new ideas, planning his days not just around what had been but what could still be. And then, on a crisp October morning, as the leaves turned gold and fire-colored, he sat once more on the porch. This time, the journal was full. Not just with his own words, but letters, notes, quotes from others he'd met along the way. People who had also realized they weren't done yet either. He thought of Ellen, of that inscription she left him. Maybe she always knew that his second chapter wouldn't be quiet. Maybe that's why she gave him the journal. Not for memory, but for movement. And just as he began to wonder what story to write next, the phone rang. It was a local high school. They'd heard about his talks. The new principal wanted to know if he'd be willing to return, this time not to teach history, but to teach life writing to students who needed guidance. Richard didn't answer right away. He looked out at the sky, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself the phrase that had become more than a sentence. It had become a calling. "You're not done yet." The sun was low in the sky when Richard pulled into the parking lot of Westbridge High School. It had been almost 2 years since he last walked those halls, and yet the building stood the same. Bricks weathered by time, windows tinted by decades of dust and sunshine, and the flag still flapping lazily out front like it always had. But he was different now. He sat in the car for a moment, letting the engine hum beneath him. The phone call from Principal Armand had come unexpectedly, but not unwelcome. The man had heard of Richard's community talks and his published essays. He said the school was piloting a mentorship and life-writing program for students struggling to stay engaged. Those lost in the shuffle, those who saw no purpose in school because they saw no future for themselves. "You don't have to say yes," the principal had said over the phone, "but I think you have something they need. Not facts, not grades, just perspective." And here he was, sitting in the parking lot with a leather-bound journal and a quiet heartbeat that had begun to speed up. Inside, the halls were quieter than he remembered, but that familiar echo of sneakers on linoleum floors brought back a wave of memories. He passed by room 204, his old classroom, and paused briefly at the door. Through the small window, he could see a younger teacher pointing toward a whiteboard filled with bullet points. A girl sat in the back row with earbuds half hidden by her hoodie, just like they used to do when he was teaching. Some things never change. But Richard wasn't here to teach curriculum. The library had been transformed for the mentorship program. Comfortable chairs, a circle of desks, soft yellow lights, and walls pinned with student art and motivational quotes. He saw a banner overhead that read, "Every story matters." That made him smile. There were only 7 students that first afternoon. A mix of boys and girls, none of them older than 17. One boy leaned so far back in his chair it was a miracle he hadn't fallen. A girl with deep brown eyes and chipped black nail polish was scrolling on her phone until she saw him walk in. They all looked at him like he was a substitute teacher who had wandered into the wrong room. "Hi," Richard said, gently placing his journal on the desk in front of him. "I'm not here to teach you anything." That made one of the boys snort. Richard smiled. I'm here because I believe there's more to your story than you've probably been told. I know what it's like to feel like the best part of your life is either too far ahead to see or already behind you. But that's not true. It's never been true. They didn't respond right away. Most stared. A few looked away. But they didn't leave. He continued. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I had nothing left to prove, no one really expecting anything from me. I was retired, alone, bored, lost, until I started writing. Just a sentence at a time. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't finished. My story hadn't ended. It had just paused. He paused and looked around. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to tell our stories. Whether they're sad or angry or quiet or loud. We're going to write them down. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find out you're not done yet either. A long silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was heavy with consideration. He had seen it in his students before, that subtle change when someone realizes they might be heard for the first time. The next few weeks passed like the changing of seasons, slow at first, and then suddenly transformative. The students, initially quiet and reluctant, began bringing pieces of themselves into the sessions. Small moments, bits of writing. One boy, Isaiah, wrote a heartbreaking letter to the father he never met. A girl named Lonnie wrote a short story about a mythical bird that could only fly after it had lost all its feathers. Richard saw himself in their pages. Raw, confused, but brave enough to begin. He never critiqued their grammar or corrected their spelling. That wasn't the point. He simply listened, and he responded with questions that pushed them further. Why do you think that moment mattered to you? What did you feel when it happened? What haven't you said out loud yet? Their notebooks began to fill, and something else started to happen too. The students began asking about him. What made you become a teacher? Did you ever mess up bad when you were our age? Do you miss her? Your wife. He didn't dodge their questions. He told them the truth. That he used to be afraid of silence. That he stayed in a job for years longer than he should have out of comfort. That yes, he missed Ellen every day, and still talked to her sometimes in his mind when he needed clarity. One day, as they were wrapping up a session, Lonnie stayed behind. She held her notebook close to her chest and asked, "Did you really think your life was over at 60? Richard chuckled softly. "Not just over. I thought I had peaked. I thought the rest was just waiting." She looked down at her shoes and whispered, "I feel that sometimes, and I'm only 16. He walked over and placed a hand gently on the back of a chair beside her. "Then you've got more time than you think to prove yourself wrong." By the end of the semester, the workshop was full. What began with 7 students had grown to 22. And it wasn't just the students changing. Richard felt alive again. He found himself waking up early to read the new pieces they submitted, responding with notes in the margins, asking for rewrites not because they were bad, but because they were important enough to get right. He started his own podcast called Second Chapters, where he interviewed people over 50 who had begun new paths after grief, failure, or retirement. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from listeners around the world. People who had picked up a paintbrush after 30 years. A woman who had launched her first business at 67. A man who had learned how to swim at 72. One of the most memorable messages came from a man in Denmark, age 81. He wrote, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not just waiting to die. I'm still growing." Richard printed that email and pinned it above his desk. He often found himself walking through the park again, but now it wasn't about passing time. He would sit on the same bench beneath the same dogwood tree, notebook in hand, observing the world not as someone forgotten, but as someone quietly building something meaningful. And sometimes, Joan would join him, sketching as he wrote, both lost in their art, both slowly falling into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find again. His days were full, but not in the way they had been during his teaching years. They were full with meaning, not obligation. And every so often, he would speak those 5 words aloud again, not as a mantra but as a mission. "You're not done yet." And still, his story was far from finished. The spring air was warmer than usual as Richard stepped into the auditorium at Westbridge High. The folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a makeshift stage had been set up at the front. It wasn't grand. No spotlights, no elaborate sound systems. But there was a quiet energy humming in the space, the kind that always gathers before something meaningful is about to happen. Today was the culmination of the storytelling program Richard had started. What began as a quiet experiment with a handful of skeptical teens had blossomed into something neither he nor Principal Armand could have anticipated. It was called New Chapters, a celebration of stories. Students, teachers, and even parents were invited to attend. The kids would share pieces of their writing aloud, many for the first time. Richard stood by the entrance, welcoming guests with a quiet nod, his fingers wrapped around the edges of his journal like a lifeline. His former students, his storytellers, were scattered throughout the room, eyes darting with nervous anticipation, gripping their papers tightly. Lonnie stood off to the side with her sketchbook. She wasn't reading today, but she had drawn a series of illustrations based on some of the stories her classmates had written. They were pinned along the back wall, forming a living mural of dreams, scars, and second chances. As the event began, Isaiah was the first to walk on stage. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice, low and steady, cut through the silence as he read his letter to the father he never met. You could feel the weight of each word. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. It was real and raw and entirely his. When he stepped down, he didn't look for applause. He walked straight to Richard and hugged him, something he'd never done before. Richard felt his throat tighten. One by one, the students followed. Stories about identity, loss, addiction, broken families, quiet victories. Some read poems, others essays or short stories that danced between fiction and truth. And though their voices sometimes cracked or stuttered, each word landed like a spark in the room. When it was Lonnie's turn, she didn't walk to the microphone. Instead, she stood by her drawings and spoke from where she was, pointing out the illustrations and explaining the stories behind them. This one is from Jade's piece, she said, gesturing to a pencil sketch of a girl curled into herself, surrounded by floating books and broken clocks. She wrote about how she feels like time's moving faster than she can catch up. So I drew her as both grounded and lost. The audience was silent, leaning in, listening. And this one, Lonnie continued, holding up a smaller image. This is based on Mr. Richard's story. I drew a bench under a tree with a notebook resting on it. Because sometimes the most important part of your story happens after you think the last page is done. Richard felt something stir in his chest, like someone had gently reached in and reminded his heart how to beat more freely. When the program ended, no one rushed to leave. People stood in clusters, talking softly, exchanging hugs, wiping away tears. Parents walked up to Richard, thanking him. One mother held her daughter's hand tightly and said, I didn't know she felt all that. I didn't know she had words for it. That night, Richard sat by the window in his small home, the quiet hum of crickets outside and a cup of tea cooling beside him. His journal lay open on the desk, but for once he didn't write. He simply stared out at the stars, letting the stillness settle. He thought about the journey he had taken, not one measured in miles or accolades, but in reconnection, in purpose. A journey that began with grief and uncertainty but led him back to the heart of what made life meaningful. He remembered the first time he walked into that library room, unsure if anyone would even listen. He remembered the silence in the air before a story was read. He remembered how a boy who never spoke in class once whispered to him, I don't hate school anymore. I just needed someone to ask me the right questions. In that moment by the window, Richard knew something deep and unshakable. This chapter was only the beginning of something larger. He began mapping out new plans, branching the program to neighboring schools, inviting local artists to participate, maybe even hosting a citywide story fair. Joan had offered to help curate a gallery. Principal Armand said he could find funding if Richard was willing to keep going. And the students? They had already started mentoring the younger ones. The phrase came to him again. 5 simple words that had once pulled him from the edge of resignation, that now pulsed through his veins like a second heartbeat. You're not done yet. It had once been a whisper of hope. Now it was a roar of momentum. A few weeks later, Richard received a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick, the paper inside crisp and formal. It was from a national foundation focused on education and youth empowerment. They had heard of the New Chapters program through the podcast and social media. They were inviting him to speak at a national summit in Chicago, a keynote speaker. He stared at the invitation, stunned. Not because he doubted his worth, but because for so long he had forgotten how much impact one life, especially one that refuses to surrender to time, can truly have. He called Joan, who whooped loud enough for the whole block to hear. Then he called Isaiah, who was now working part-time at the library and saving up for college. And then he called his sister, who cried and said, "You found your way again, didn't you?" At the summit, Richard stood before a crowd of hundreds, a sea of faces both young and old. His voice was calm, assured, the voice of a man who had lived through the in-between and returned with something worth sharing. He told them about his wife, about his retirement, about how grief had hollowed him but writing had filled him back in. He told them about Lonnie and Isaiah, about chipped nail polish and mythical birds, about benches and notebooks and the stories that wait for permission to be written. He ended with a truth that had taken him over 60 years to learn. The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves is that our time has passed. That if we didn't do something big by 30 or 40 or 50, then it's too late. But I'm here to tell you, it's not. As long as there's breath in you, there is ink left in your pen. And the world needs your story, now more than ever. He closed his speech not with applause in mind, but with those same 5 words that had become his guiding star. You're not done yet. And somewhere in the back of the room, a young teacher stood up and started to cry. Not out of sadness, but because she realized for the first time that maybe she wasn't done either. After the summit in Chicago, Richard's life unfolded in directions he never could have scripted. He returned to Westbridge with new energy, a head full of ideas, and a heart brimming with something he hadn't fully felt in years. Conviction. The kind of conviction that makes you get out of bed early, skip the evening news, and jot down messy notes at midnight because the vision won't let you rest. The students had been following the summit updates online. Isaiah had even streamed the keynote speech on his phone in the back of the library, holding it up proudly like it was his uncle on TV. Lonnie texted a single sentence after watching, "You looked like you belonged there." Those words stayed with Richard longer than she could have imagined. Within 2 months, the New Chapters program expanded beyond Westbridge High. Nearby schools reached out, some cautiously, unsure of how it would work, others desperate for something that might break through the walls so many students were quietly building around themselves. He began hosting weekend workshops in community centers and public libraries. Some kids brought nothing but silence. Others came with poems stuffed in old backpacks. One boy, no older than 14, handed Richard a story scribbled on the back of fast food receipts. He had written it during late-night shifts helping his uncle at a gas station. As Richard read the smudged words under flickering fluorescent lights, he felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that always hit him when someone entrusted him with their truth. He listened. He asked questions. He encouraged. Never once did he make it about performance. This wasn't school. This was sanctuary. But change brings attention, and attention brings pressure. One evening, after a long day of meetings with potential sponsors and district officials, Richard sat at his desk surrounded by papers, funding proposals, and scribbled story outlines. The light from his desk lamp cast long shadows over his notebooks. He stared at a letter he had received earlier that week. A large nonprofit wanted to acquire the New Chapters name and roll it into a national initiative. On paper, it was flattering: more reach, more resources, more hands on deck. But buried in the contract was a line that haunted him. All stories will be evaluated for educational value and subject to review. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He wasn't sure why it unsettled him so much at first. But as he thought more deeply, he realized it was because these stories weren't data points. They weren't projects to be reviewed or filtered through an academic lens. They were lives. Messy, real, unfinished lives. And to impose rules on which stories were acceptable was to repeat the very mistake that silenced so many of them in the first place. He declined the offer the next day. Some called him foolish. Others called him idealistic. But Richard didn't flinch. He knew now what he stood for and, more importantly, who he stood with. The stories kept coming. A girl in Detroit wrote about growing up with 3 younger siblings and no parents, and how writing gave her the courage to apply for a scholarship. A retired firefighter from New Mexico sent a letter describing how, at 67, he finally wrote about the fire that took 2 of his friends. A young man in Oregon emailed Richard with a short story called The Day I Didn't Give Up, inspired by the phrase he now saw stitched into his school library's mural. "You're not done yet." Every week, Richard read these stories aloud on his podcast. He didn't dramatize them. He didn't need to. He let the words speak. And people listened. The subscriber count grew. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered were the emails. The ones that said, "I thought I was invisible until I heard that episode." Or, "My daughter hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks, but she wrote something today. Thank you." Through all this, his relationship with Joan deepened. She wasn't just his neighbor or his sketching companion anymore. They had quietly begun a rhythm together, a comfortable, deliberate companionship. Some evenings they worked on joint projects. Story collections paired with illustrations, journals made from recycled materials, creative writing prompts printed on postcards. They called it pen and brush. They were invited to speak together at a small arts retreat in Vermont. Joan shared how visual art helped her process the grief of losing her son, and how collaborating with Richard had brought her creativity back to life. Richard talked about the power of late chapters and unexpected returns. "We are not what we used to be," he said softly into the microphone. "But that doesn't mean we are any less. We are becoming." Still. Afterward, a woman approached them. She was quiet, maybe in her early 70s, her voice trembling. "I used to write poetry," she said. "Stopped after my husband died. I didn't see the point anymore. But maybe there's still a few poems left in me." Richard smiled. He had heard those words before. Different voices, different versions, but the same core longing. Maybe I'm not done yet. When they returned home, the idea for a new initiative came to life. Late Bloomers. A branch of New Chapters dedicated to adults over 50 who were ready to tell the stories they'd never had space to share. Community centers, retirement homes, online forums. Richard didn't care where the story came from, as long as it was honest. A woman from Alabama wrote about surviving cancer twice and learning to sing at 60. A former prison inmate sent a memoir in fragments. 1 page per week, each one soaked in regret, redemption, and raw hope. People often asked Richard now, "When will you write your book?" And he always replied with a soft chuckle, "I'm still living it." His own story was no longer just in his journal. It was in every voice that trembled at the start of a sentence. In every page smudged with ink and emotion. In every moment someone decided they were still worth listening to. And still, the journey continued. Richard stood once more beneath the dogwood tree, notebook in hand, spring wind brushing past his face. Joan sat beside him, sketching. A group of students was gathered nearby on picnic blankets, reading aloud, laughing, sharing edits. The sky was painted in hues of orange and gold, as if even the sun was eager to hear what came next. He turned a page in his journal and wrote a single line. "The story is still unfolding." One quiet evening, nearly a year after that first New Chapters showcase in the school auditorium, Richard sat alone on a worn bench overlooking a lake just outside of town. It was a place he hadn't returned to in years, not since the early days after Ellen passed. Back then, he'd come here hoping for silence, hoping the water would carry away his pain. But today, it wasn't grief that brought him. It was something else. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim leather-bound notebook. Its pages were soft from use, corners bent, margins filled with scribbles, dates, and unfinished thoughts. He ran his fingers along the cover for a moment, then opened it to a blank page and began to write, the same way he had written every day since he found his voice again. The sun was setting slowly, casting long streaks of gold across the surface of the lake. The sound of geese echoed in the distance, and a soft breeze stirred the pages. He paused, lifted his gaze, and smiled at the way the light hit the water. Calm, enduring, certain. In that stillness, memories came, not as sharp stabs, but as warm echoes. He saw Ellen, standing barefoot in their kitchen, humming as she watered the basil in the windowsill. He heard her laughter bouncing through their little home, the way she once said, "Don't just grow old, Richard. Grow forward." For a long time, he thought that meant moving on. Now, he understood it differently. Growing forward wasn't about leaving anything behind. It was about bringing everything with you. The pain, the joy, the failure, the hope, and choosing to keep walking. Choosing to keep becoming. A rustle in the distance pulled him gently from the past. Footsteps, light, hesitant. Then a voice. "Mr. Richard?" He turned. It was Isaiah, now 18, taller than Richard remembered, with a college hoodie and a worn messenger bag slung over his shoulder. In his hand was a notebook that looked a lot like the one Richard had given him 2 years ago. "I figured you might be here," Isaiah said, sitting beside him on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the ripples on the lake. "I wanted to tell you something," Isaiah finally said. "I got accepted. Full scholarship. Creative writing." Richard didn't speak. His eyes filled instead. He reached over and placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "I'm not the same kid who walked into that dusty library room," Isaiah added. "And I know I still have a long way to go, but I'm ready for it. I'm not afraid anymore." A quiet nod was all Richard could manage, but it was enough. Isaiah opened his notebook, flipped to a page, and handed it to him. "I've been working on this piece. I was wondering if you'd take a look." Richard took it gently, the way a person handles something sacred. He read in silence, his eyes moving slowly, carefully, as if each word was a step on a bridge someone had built by hand. When he finished, he looked up. "It's strong. It's honest. You've found your voice." Isaiah gave a small, proud smile. "Thanks to you." "No," Richard said softly. "Thanks to you not giving up." They watched the last light sink below the horizon. The stars began to appear, one by one, like stories waiting to be noticed. Richard thought about all the people he'd met over the past few years. The woman in Vermont who rediscovered poetry. The boy who wrote on the back of receipts. The veterans. The teachers. The late bloomers. The young dreamers. All of them had carried something inside them. Something quiet, powerful, and ready. All they needed was the courage, the moment, or the voice to whisper, "You're not done yet." He stood slowly, his knees creaking, and stretched. Isaiah followed. They walked the path back to the road, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. Before they parted, Isaiah turned. "Hey, Mr. Richard, when's your book coming out?" Richard laughed quietly. "Still working on it." "What's it called?" He thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the sky above, stars blinking like punctuation marks. "I think I'll call it The Next Chapter." Isaiah smiled. "Sounds like something I'd read." Richard watched him go, the young man he had once reached for now walking boldly into his own future. He stood for a moment longer, letting the night wrap around him. And as he turned to head home, one phrase returned to him, not as an echo now, but as a steady drumbeat in his heart. "You're not done yet." Because as long as stories are left untold, as long as voices wait to be heard, as long as a soul stirs with purpose, there is still more to give, more to write, more to become. And Richard, with pen in hand and light in his chest, was already beginning the next page.